Morgan Freeman hands a homeless man $50,000. What happens next leaves everyone speechless. The bustling city streets were filled with hurried footsteps, indifferent glances, and the occasional honking of impatient drivers. Among the sea of people, an old man sat quietly beside a small wooden bookstand. Nobody paid him any mind until a deep, familiar voice cut through the noise. What happened next stunned everyone. Does respect come from wealth, or is it something more? Comment 1 for no, 0 for yes. Lucas Bennett had spent the last 6 months on the same street corner, arranging his small collection of secondhand books each morning with steady, practiced hands. He wasn't begging, nor was he looking for sympathy. He simply wanted to earn a living with dignity. Yet, dignity was something few seemed to recognize. People passed by without a second glance. Some sneered, some whispered, others chuckled as they read the handwritten sign propped up against his stand. Books hold wisdom, no matter how worn their pages may be. A businessman in a sharp suit paused momentarily, glancing at an old Hemingway novel before scoffing, "Who even reads books like these anymore?" He walked away without another word. Lucas sighed, but didn't let the insult shake him. He had heard worse. The world had little patience for those who refused to beg, yet refused to disappear. Then one afternoon, just as he was closing up, he heard footsteps slow in front of his stand. A deep, velvety voice spoke, carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "You mind if I take a look?" Lucas looked up. The man before him was tall, wearing a simple brown coat, his eyes kind yet intense. Something about that voice sent a ripple through the air. The murmurs of the street quieted as people started to notice. And when they realized who was standing there, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. What was Morgan Freeman doing at an old bookstand on a forgotten corner of the city? The moment Morgan Freeman spoke, it was as if time itself had paused. The city noise faded into the background. Even those who had walked past without a second glance turned back. Their curiosity piqued. Lucas blinked, taken aback. He had grown used to indifference, to being ignored. But now, standing before him was a man whose presence alone commanded attention, not because of status, but because of the way he carried himself. Morgan reached out, picking up a book from the stack. His fingers traced the worn spine with a quiet reverence, as if he understood the history embedded in its pages. "Hemingway," he murmured, turning the book over in his hands. "A first edition. You don't see many of these anymore." Lucas cleared his throat, still unsure if this was real or just a figment of his tired mind. "Yeah, that one's a rare find," he replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "People don't appreciate old books like they used to." Morgan chuckled, a deep, soothing sound. "That's a shame. The world moves too fast these days. No one stops to listen, to learn." Lucas nodded, understanding all too well. He had spent decades teaching literature before life had taken an unkind turn. His wife's illness, the endless medical bills, the quiet unraveling of everything he had once built. It had all led him here to this street corner, selling the very thing he had once devoted his life to teaching. But he refused to beg. He refused to let pity define him. Morgan turned his gaze to Lucas, studying him with a quiet intensity. "How long have you been out here?" Lucas hesitated, then exhaled. 6 months. I lost my wife last year. Sold everything I could to cover the hospital bills. This," he gestured to the bookstand, "this is what I have left." There was no pity in Morgan's expression, only respect. "I see," he said simply, placing the Hemingway book back on the stack with the same care he had picked it up. A woman nearby, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, whispered to her companion, "Is that really Morgan Freeman?" The whisper spread like wildfire. Phones were pulled out, cameras clicked, people started inching closer. Lucas noticed the shift in the crowd, the way strangers who had ignored him moments ago were now watching with rapt attention. Not because of him, but because of the man standing at his bookstand. He had been invisible before, but now suddenly he mattered. Morgan, however, remained unfazed. His focus stayed on Lucas, as if the rest of the world had simply faded away. "What do you love most about books?" he asked. Lucas hesitated, caught off guard by the question, but then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt foreign on his face after so many months of struggle. "Books don't judge you," he said. "They don't care who you are, where you come from, how much money you have. They treat everyone the same. They let you escape, teach you things, make you feel less alone." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "That's true," he agreed. "And yet, people don't always extend the same courtesy to each other." Lucas swallowed. There was something in Morgan's words, something that struck deeper than he expected. "I've seen it all my life," Morgan continued, his voice lowering slightly. "People walk past those they don't think matter. They judge by appearance, by circumstance, without ever stopping to understand the person standing in front of them." Lucas glanced at the crowd forming around them. He could see it in their eyes, the way they suddenly saw him differently, as if being acknowledged by someone important had changed his worth in an instant. "They only care now because of you," Lucas admitted quietly. Morgan didn't deny it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "How much for the Hemingway?" Lucas frowned, unsure how to answer. "It's priced at $10, but—" Morgan didn't let him finish. He pulled out a checkbook, and then, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, he wrote down a figure that made Lucas's breath hitch. $50,000. The air grew thick with silence. A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her chest. A man swore under his breath. Lucas's hands trembled as Morgan tore the check from his book and held it out. "I don't believe in charity," Morgan said firmly. "I believe in value. And this book, this moment, is worth far more than $10. Lucas stared at the check, his throat tightening. I can't accept this." Morgan tilted his head, his expression both patient and unwavering. "Then don't think of it as a gift. Think of it as what the world owes you for a lifetime of wisdom." Lucas looked up, searching the older man's face for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. The check remained between them, an offering not of pity, but of respect. And then, before Lucas could decide whether to accept it or not, a voice from the crowd broke the moment. A cold, sharp voice that shattered the air like glass. "That's ridiculous. He's just an old man selling junk." In an instant, the moment of kindness turned into something far more complicated. Would respect win, or would prejudice prove stronger? The words cut through the moment like a blade. Lucas turned his head toward the source of the voice, his fingers still hovering over the check that Morgan Freeman held out to him. The air had changed. What had been a quiet, almost sacred moment between two men now crackled with tension. A middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit stood near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was one of open skepticism, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're really giving 50 grand for a dusty old book?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, Mr. Freeman, you're a smart man. You know that's not worth it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people murmured in agreement, others exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had been awestruck by the moment seconds before now hesitated, second-guessing what they had just witnessed. Lucas felt the weight of their judgment settle on him like a heavy coat, suffocating and unwanted. Morgan, however, didn't flinch. He studied the man in the suit with the same measured calm he had shown since the beginning, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Tell me," Morgan said, his voice smooth but firm. "What do you think something is worth?" The man let out a small laugh as if the answer were obvious. "That depends. Money, status, market demand, basic economics." He gestured to Lucas's stand. "These books? They're worthless. No one's buying them. That's just the way the world works." Lucas swallowed hard, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. He had heard variations of those words before, over and over again. They had been whispered behind his back, muttered by passers-by, reinforced by every rejection, every look of dismissal. But this time, he wasn't alone. Morgan Freeman set the check down on the bookstand, then took a slow step forward, his presence commanding even in the open air. Tell me something, Morgan continued, his voice dropping just slightly. If I walked past a starving man on the street and I gave him food, would that food have value? The man in the suit hesitated, sensing the shift in the conversation. I mean, yes, to him, but that's charity, not value. Morgan nodded. And if I took that same food and placed it on a billionaire's table, what would it be worth then? The man frowned. It wouldn't matter to him. He could buy 1,000 meals like it. Morgan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. So the food itself hasn't changed, only the perception of who needs it. A ripple went through the crowd. Some people nodded, others still seemed uncertain, but no one interrupted. Lucas sat frozen, listening, watching. Morgan took another step forward. You think these books are worthless because they don't have a price tag that fits your definition of value. But tell me, if I held up a $100 bill, crumpled it, stepped on it, dragged it through the mud, would it still be worth $100? The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably but kept his chin raised. Of course, Morgan's eyes gleamed. Then why do you think a man's worth diminishes just because life has crumpled him a little? Silence. Lucas felt his throat tighten, an unexpected emotion rising within him. For months he had endured the quiet dismissal of strangers, the slow erosion of his dignity. Yet here stood a man he had never met, defending not just his books, but him. The suited man cleared his throat, clearly realizing he had lost whatever point he was trying to make. With an exaggerated shrug, he muttered, "Fine, whatever. It's your money." He turned and walked away, but the weight of his words lingered in the air like a stain. Morgan turned back to Lucas, his eyes kind but unwavering. "You don't have to take the check," he said, "but I need you to understand something." Lucas met his gaze, feeling smaller under its intensity. "What's that?" Morgan gestured to the crowd. "They only saw you when I saw you, but I didn't change your worth. You were always valuable. They just needed to be reminded." Lucas swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. He wasn't sure how to respond, wasn't sure if he even could. A young woman near the front of the crowd suddenly stepped forward, timid but determined. She picked up a book from the stack and turned to Lucas. "How much is this one?" Lucas hesitated, glancing at the book in her hands, a well-worn collection of poetry. His voice was almost hoarse when he answered, $5. She nodded and handed him a crisp bill. Then, as if something had broken loose in the crowd, others stepped forward too. "I'll take this one." "How much for this set?" "I don't even read poetry, but I want to support you." Lucas barely processed what was happening. For months he had waited for customers, for someone to see the value in what he had to offer. And now, in the span of minutes, the books he had once thought would sit untouched forever were being carried away by hands that had finally decided to reach for them. Morgan watched quietly, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. He placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder before finally stepping back. "I have what I need," he said, tapping the Hemingway book he had purchased. "The rest is up to you." Lucas stared after him as he walked away, disappearing into the city streets as if he had never been there. The check still lay on the bookstand, untouched. But for the first time in a long time, Lucas wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had just regained. But just when Lucas thought his life was about to turn around, an unexpected visitor arrived, bringing news that would change everything. The check still sat on the bookstand, untouched. Lucas could barely process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. His books that had gathered dust for months, were now vanishing into eager hands. Strangers, the same ones who had passed him by countless times, were now standing before him, handing him crisp bills, smiling as they walked away with books pressed to their chests. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as an old man sitting on the sidewalk, but as someone who had something valuable to offer. Morgan Freeman had walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there. And yet the ripple effect of his words remained, spreading through the people gathered like a quiet revolution. Lucas took a deep breath, his fingers lightly brushing against the check. $50,000. enough to change his life, enough to find a real place to live, to rebuild. But before he could decide what to do with it, a shadow fell over his stand. He looked up, and his stomach dropped. A man in a dark overcoat stood before him, his expression unreadable. His neatly pressed suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the worn-down sidewalk beneath him. His piercing blue eyes swept over the bookstand before finally landing on Lucas. It had been years since Lucas had seen him, but he would recognize that face anywhere. "Hello, Lucas," the man said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "It's been a long time." The air around them shifted. The hum of the street seemed distant, muted, as if the world had pulled back to make space for this moment. Lucas clenched his jaw. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" Andrew Donahue, his former business partner. The man who had once been his closest friend, his confidant, until betrayal had shattered everything. Andrew gave a small, humorless smile. "I saw the video." Lucas's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. The video. It must have spread faster than he realized. It wasn't just the crowd here that had seen what happened. People online had too, and Andrew had been watching. Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "And? What do you want?" Andrew leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I think you know." Lucas knew all too well. Years ago, he and Andrew had built a business together, a thriving bookstore, a place where literature lovers gathered, where discussions stretched long into the night over coffee and ink-smudged pages. It had been their shared dream, until greed got in the way. Andrew had sold the store from under him, without warning, without discussion. One day it had been their bookstore, the next it had belonged to a faceless corporation, and Lucas had been left with nothing. His wife's illness had come soon after. The mounting bills, the loss of their home. Every piece of stability had crumbled, leaving him here on this street corner selling books to survive. And now Andrew had returned. "I came to make things right," Andrew said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I want to buy back the store. Put your name on it again." Lucas felt his breath catch. For years he had dreamed of that store, of stepping back into the place where he had belonged, of running his fingers along familiar wooden bookshelves, of unlocking the doors in the early morning light, of greeting customers like he used to, but he had learned the hard way that dreams could be dangerous things. He narrowed his eyes. "And what do you get out of this?" Andrew's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're trending, Lucas. Morgan Freeman just handed you 50 grand in front of the whole world. People love a comeback story. You go back to the store, we rebuild it together, and we ride the wave." Lucas's chest tightened. So that was it. Andrew wasn't here because he regretted what he had done. He wasn't here to fix the past. He was here because Lucas was suddenly valuable again. Just like the books he had been selling all this time. Discarded when they seemed useless, sought after the moment someone important deemed them worthy. Lucas looked at the check still lying on the bookstand. Morgan had said it wasn't charity, that it was a payment for something that had always had value, even if no one had seen it. But this was different. Lucas met Andrew's gaze, searching for something, anything that might prove his old friend was being sincere, but all he saw was calculation. Slowly, Lucas reached for the check. The crowd around them had begun to thin, but a few lingered, still caught in the aftershocks of what had happened earlier. A young woman with a book in her hands looked on curiously. A man near the curb whispered something to his friend. People were still watching. Lucas turned the check over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it. $50,000. He looked back at Andrew, then without breaking eye contact, he slowly tore the check in half. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Andrew's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What the hell are you doing?" Lucas's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not for sale." Andrew took a step back, eyes narrowing, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "You're making a mistake." Lucas shook his head. Number I finally got something back today that I lost a long time ago, and I'm not trading it in just because you suddenly decided I was worth something again. For the first time since he had arrived, Andrew looked uncertain. Then his face hardened. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, vanishing into the city like a ghost from the past. Lucas exhaled, his hands still shaking. The torn check fluttered onto the bookstand, forgotten. The young woman who had been watching from a distance stepped forward hesitantly. "You really just gave up 50 grand?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. Lucas turned to her, then at the remaining books on his stand. His voice was quieter this time, but steady. "Some things aren't worth selling," he said simply. The young woman studied him for a moment. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a book, and placed it gently on the stand. "I think you should have this," she said softly. Lucas picked it up. The title sent a shiver through him. The Measure of a Man. But just as Lucas thought he had reclaimed his dignity, another twist awaited, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about second chances. Lucas sat at his bookstand long after the crowd had dispersed, the city returning to its usual rhythm. The torn check lay in pieces, but for the first time in years he felt whole. He picked up the book the young woman had left, The Measure of a Man. The title lingered in his mind, echoing the lesson he had learned today. Then, just as he was about to close up for the evening, a familiar presence loomed near. Andrew Donahue stood a few feet away, no longer the smug businessman from earlier. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his expression unreadable. Lucas exhaled slowly. "You come to tell me I made a mistake again?" Andrew shook his head. "No." He hesitated, glancing at the torn check still on the table. "I came to say, maybe I did." For the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his voice, only something quieter. Something almost like regret. Lucas studied him, waiting. Andrew rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze flickering to the bookstand. "You were right, I saw your worth too late. I let money blind me. I don't expect you to forgive me, but..." He swallowed hard. "I wanted you to know that I see it now." Lucas let the words settle between them. He could still feel the weight of old wounds, of broken trust. But he also knew that growth could only begin when someone was willing to face their mistakes. Finally, he nodded. "Then prove it." Andrew met his gaze, something shifting in his expression. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, not in dismissal, but in thought. Lucas watched him go, then looked down at the book in his hands. He had spent so long waiting for others to see his value, but today he had learned the most important truth of all. His worth had never been theirs to decide. Through this story, we realize that true worth isn't measured by wealth, status, or possessions, but by how we treat others. Respect should never be conditional. It should be given freely, regardless of someone's circumstances. Dignity isn't something we wait for others to grant us. It's something we hold on to, even when the world looks away. This story reminds us that kindness has the power to restore what was lost, and that sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to let the world decide our value, because in the end, it's not what you own. It's how you choose to live.